184. Peter rubbed the chisel handle with oiled steel wool, trying to resist the urge to throw it across the barn. The morning had been good. He'd crouched over field and woods, through mud and gravel, up hills and down rock faces, over stone walls and under fences. Strong, tireless, and nearly as fast as if he'd had both boots on the ground. At noon, he'd told Vola he felt ready to go now, and he was. But she had ignored him as usual. She'd ordered him into the barn to rest and taken his crutches hostage. Foot up. Polish some tools. Get the hand feel of them. Page 185. His gaze fell on the near-finished carving in front of him on the workbench. The fox was rough, but it looked alive, and it seemed to him a sign that he would find Pax unharmed. Although it felt dangerous to hope, he allowed himself to imagine the scene. He would call for Pax at the spot where he'd left him, and Pax would come bursting out of the woods and probably knock him down in his happiness. They would go home together. "You're going to polish that handle right off, boy." Peter jumped. "I didn't hear you come in." "You can't go drifting off when you're working with tools." Vola settled herself on a barrel beside him and picked up a rasp and an oily cloth. "I was thinking about Pax." He put down the gleaming chisel and picked up his carving. He handed it over when Vola held out a palm. "Looks like he wants to jump out of my hand. You're worried about him?" Peter nodded. "But half the time I think he could be all right. Foxes are smart, really smart. We had to lock the door to the kitchen because Pax could open every cupboard. Once, he chewed through the wire to a fan we'd just put in my room. My father was really mad. But then, page 186, when he was trying to fix it, he found out the fan had a short in the housing. It would have caught fire. I think Pax knew that somehow, that he was protecting me. So why wouldn't he be smart enough to learn to hunt? Don't you think he could survive?" "I do," Vola agreed. Peter took the carving back and looked into the fox's face. "There's something else," he said. "It's that, I would know if he'd died." And then he told Vola what he'd never told anyone else, about the merging he felt sometimes with Pax, how sometimes he didn't just know what his fox was feeling but actually felt it himself. He held his breath, hearing how crazy it sounded. Instead of laughing, Vola told him he was lucky. "You've experienced two but not two." "That's on your board, two but not two." I didn't know what it meant. "It's a Buddhist concept. Non-duality. It's about oneness, about how things that seem to be separate are really connected to one another. There are no separations." Vola picked up his fox again. "This is not just a piece of wood. This is also the clouds that brought the rain that watered the tree, and the birds that nested in it and the squirrels," page 187, "that fed on its nuts. It is also the food my grandparents fed me that made me strong enough to cut the tree, and it's the steel in the axe I used. And it's how you know your fox, which allowed you to carve him yesterday. And it's the story you will tell your children when you give this to them. All these things are separate but also one, inseparable. Do you see? Two but not two. Inseparable. So, a couple of nights ago, I was sure that Pax had eaten. I felt it. Last night, I saw the moon, and I knew Pax was seeing it right then, too. Do you think that if I feel Pax living, then he's alive?" "Yes." Peter's hopes swelled at her words. Vola never said anything she didn't mean. "We tell the truth here, that's the rule." She'd told him that about 100 times. It was a valuable thing, he suddenly realized, to have someone you could count on for honesty. How many times in his life had he wanted only that? How many questions had he needed an honest answer for and gotten instead, from his father, dark silence? And then, before he could chicken out, he asked the one that haunted him. Page 188. Do you think if someone had a wild part, it could ever be tamed out? If it's in his nature? Inherited? Vola looked at him hard. Peter knew she thought he was asking about Pax, and he didn't correct her. He picked up the chisel again and looked down at it on his lap, His fingers squeezed wide around the shank as he waited for the answer. "You always been like this? Asking other people to figure out your stuff for you? Eh? That doesn't work." Peter let out his breath. As soon as he'd asked the question, he'd realized he didn't want to hear the answer. Maybe he would never be ready to hear the answer to that question. Vola patted her overall pocket and frowned. Almost forgot. She pulled out a napkin-wrapped muffin and handed it to Peter. He'd eaten 4 of them at breakfast, but she was always convinced that he wasn't eating enough. He unwrapped it. It was a little squashed, but as with the rest of them, the pecan was centered perfectly on the brown sugar topping. She'd stayed up late last night baking them, and he had heard her singing something in page 189, a language he didn't recognize. Something happy. "Vola, why are you still living out here alone?" "I told you." "But 20 years to figure out who you are? I mean, how hard can it be?" "Plenty hard. The plain truth can be the hardest thing to see when it's about yourself. If you don't want to know the truth, you'll do anything to disguise it." Peter put the muffin down. She was avoiding his question. "But you do. You know yourself. So how come you don't go live somewhere with people? Tell me the truth. That's the rule around here, right?" She looked out the barn window for a minute. Her shoulders slumped, and when she turned to him, she looked tired. "Fair enough, no bat Peter. Maybe it's because I do know myself. Maybe what I know is that I don't belong with people. Maybe I am a grenade." "What do you mean, a grenade?" "What would you call someone who can go from a girl eating peaches and watching fireflies to a woman who kills a man? Eh? That girl would have cut off her arm before she'd have hurt a single one of those fireflies, but a few years later she killed a perfect stranger. I'd call that person, page 190, a weapon. I'm an unpredictable, deadly weapon. It's best I stay hidden here, where no one will ever be hurt by me, even by accident." She raised her fingers and popped them at him, boom. But this time the gesture looked sad, not menacing. "You don't hurt me," Peter answered. "How do you know I won't?" "Because I know." He thumped his chest. "In my core." Vola slapped her palms on the workbench and pushed herself off. "Put those tools back in the right order," she muttered over her shoulder as she left. From the window, Peter watched her stamp down the path. It seemed she was moving differently. As if that heart pine leg of hers had grown even heavier. One by one, Peter slid the clean tools into their pockets and then rolled the canvas. He felt his old anxiety coiling at the base of his skull. Over a week he'd been stuck here. He would have left already if it hadn't been for the third condition. He'd promised, and he owed it to Vola. But when he'd asked her at breakfast about building the stage, she'd only shrugged. "I'll get to it." And then the solution hit him, so ridiculously simple that he laughed out loud. Page 191, without his crutches he was awkward and slow again, but he managed to hop outside to where Vola kept a brush pile. There, he chose 12 long straight saplings, each the thickness of his arm. One by one, he flung them to the barn doorway, then followed and slid them inside. On the sawhorses, he stripped them of their branches, then set to work. And 2 hours later, he had a stage. It wasn't much to look at, the corners raggedly notched and lashed with twine, mismatched scrap boards nailed onto the frame for the walls and floor, but when he strung a length of burlap over the top, he smiled. "Piece of cake," he said to Francois, who wandered in and stopped to sniff the frame in obvious admiration. "Piece of cake. I made the stage. It's in the barn." Vola looked up from the chicken she was plucking. She eyed the branch Peter was leaning on and then motioned to his crutches, propped against the kitchen counter. Peter reached for them, slid them under his arms, and felt the immediate comfort they brought. "I can do that puppet show for you now. Come to the barn." "I have work to do now. But all right. Tonight." Page 192, and then I can leave, Vola. I'm ready. Vola laid the chicken on the table and sighed. "You are not ready. You sleep indoors, dry and warm. You have clean water, and someone cooks your food for you. But all right, tomorrow I will test you. 10 miles. You hike 5 miles, show me you can make a camp on one leg, and hike 5 miles back. Then we'll talk. Peter watched her gather up the chicken feathers and tuck them into a pouch. And it struck him, nothing would change after he left. Vola would save her feathers, would make her puppets all alone in the woods, more and more and more of them, and tell that soldier's story to no one. Page 193. Image. No description. Pax watched Runt all night and into the next day from a bush not far away. He left only to soothe his burned lip in the cool river mud and make a meal of the small fish he found lying on the bank. His sense of smell returned, and whenever he woke from a fitful doze, he sniffed for Bristle and Runt to reassure himself that they were still alive. Bristle had dragged Brush to the fallen tree to shelter her brother and curled her body over his to keep him warm. She left him briefly a few times, and when she did, Pax quietly took her place beside Runt's motionless form. Page 194, he was there when Runt finally woke with a whimper. Pax nuzzled Runt's shoulder to comfort him. Runt lifted his head. His eyes were clouded with pain and fear. He cried out again, and Bristle, who had been hunting nearby, trotted back to him. Pax pulled back, respectful, but Bristle merely settled herself alongside her brother, her cheek beside his. Pax bent to Runt's wound and licked it cautiously, wary of Bristle's reaction. She watched him carefully but did not object. Pax set to a thorough cleaning of the wound. Runt watched him with a trusting gaze and did not flinch. When Pax finished, he cleaned Runt's face and ears, and Bristle allowed it. When Runt had fallen asleep again, Pax stayed beside the two. Together, he and Bristle watched the activity of the camp. Although the humans did not return to the ruined part of the field, the scents were dangerous. When the wind was from the west, carrying the smell of burned land, the men seemed tense. More arrived at the camp, with more machines. At the sudden growl of an engine, Bristle jumped. She laid her head back over her brother's. I must move him soon. Page 195, humans cannot scent. If we are hidden from view, we are safe. Bristle looked from him to the men. We are not safe if a single human is nearby. Bristle seemed lessened to Pax, as if a vital piece of her had disappeared. He knew that somehow the humans had taken it. My boy does not bring harm. He is not like them. He is not warsick. The warsick are full grown. He is still young. No. It is another difference. Pax was sure of this, but he was also confused. Over the past year, Peter had grown taller and stronger, and his voice had deepened. But more than that, his scent had changed. It was no longer the scent of a child. He is not young. But he is not warsick. The last day I saw him, he cared for me, although he himself was in pain. His eyes shed water. His eyes were wounded? Pax thought for a moment about the mystery of crying. No. When he is hurt in other places, his eyes shed water. It streams down his face. I think the pain is relieved by the flowing water. But his breath, he gulps for air, as though this pain water may be drowning him. The vixen bent to lick more dried blood from her, page 196, sleeping brother's haunch. After a while, she raised her gaze to Pax, and in it, Pax saw the terrible things that had been done to her family by humans. And then Pax understood something. Peter had thrown the toy into the woods that last day. The pain water had been flowing from his eyes, but he had thrown the toy. And he had not followed. My boy is not warsick. But he has changed. He is now false acting. 197. Peter lit the 4 big lanterns hanging from the barn rafters. The tools, the sharpening wheel, the wall full of puppets, all glowed warm and cheerful in the cones of amber light. Even the hay shone like Rumpelstiltskin's gold. The barn looked reborn but familiar. He knew it like a home now. Home. As soon as he'd put on Vola's puppet show, Just another hour from now, he would finally be free to start out again. He lit the two small lanterns near the stage and lifted Sinbad from the wall. Showtime. The Marionettes, page 198. Black eyes looked back at him blankly. Peter checked the joints, still amazed that Vola had taken the puppet apart just so he could learn its secrets. And suddenly Vola's secret philosophy card flashed in his mind: I would have been a good teacher. She was right about that. He thought about how easily she suggested techniques in his drills without making a big deal of anything. How she had him watch while she carved, then let him figure out things for himself. How she asked him questions about everything and didn't answer for him. But she was all wrong about being too dangerous to be near people. Anyone who knew her would tell her that. The problem was that no one knew her. Except maybe him. He hung the marionette back on the wall. I think, Sinbad, I'm going to give you the night off. He went outside and fished a wrist-thick limb out of the brush pile. Back inside, he sawed off the ends and nailed on a base. He lashed the rock's tin bowl nest to the top, then fixed it on the stage. Next, he lifted the sorceress puppet from its perch and unscrewed its left leg. Page 199. Ready? Vola called out. Peter climbed the stack of hay bales he'd set up behind the stage and picked up the sorceress's controls, surprised his hands weren't shaking. Because suddenly, everything he'd been so sure of an hour ago now seemed like a terrible idea. When she'd come into the barn, Vola had been wearing a long purple skirt instead of her overalls, and she had combed her hair, something Peter had never seen before. She had been astounded at the stage he'd built, and it hadn't been an act. You have the makings of a woodworker, she'd said. If I were in the market for an apprentice, I'd offer you the spot. In another few minutes, what would she think of him? It was too late for second-guessing, though. Ready, he lied. Vola turned down the 4 overhead lanterns, then Peter heard her drag a stool to the middle of the barn. This is the story of a girl, he said. He heard Vola take in a sharp breath. And then he didn't hear a sound after that. Not when he pulled the curtain and drew the sorceress up from the plank, not when the seed corn he'd piled on her stomach like peaches spilled off. Not when he wrapped her in his camouflage t-shirt, tucked her hair into a, page 200, clay bowl helmet, and slid the stick into her hand as a rifle. Not when he had her shoot the rifle, not when he unscrewed her leg, not when he made her climb to the nest. Peter had expected a protest when he lit the nest on fire, but still Vola didn't make a sound. And just as he'd practiced, the fire was only a momentary flare as the handful of wood shavings in the bowl flashed up. Just enough time for him to take off the marionette's army uniform. He drew her up out of the nest and eased her to the stage, where he'd propped the child puppet beside his carved fox. He had her bend low to the child, then turn and stroke the fox. And then he pulled the curtain. Peter hung the controls. He waited, but still there was only silence. He stretched to look over the stage. Vola stared straight ahead, right through him, her face as rigid as if it had been carved of wood. The tears streaming down her cheeks gleamed in the flickering light. Somehow they only served to make her look noble. I'm sorry. I only meant. You're not a grenade. You're good. You took me in. You're training me so I can get packs. Leave me alone, boy. Her voice was low and wiretight. Page 201. Wait. I think it's stupid to waste your life out here for some kind of punishment. I mean, maybe that guy didn't even care about that book. Maybe he won it in a poker game the night before. Maybe what he cared about was, I don't know, Peter steeled himself, being a teacher or something. At the word teacher, Vola shot her chin at him, but he didn't look away. Yeah, maybe he wanted to be a teacher. So maybe you should go do that for him. But you'll never know, so I think you should go out and live your life. I'm just saying that whatever bad thing wrecked you before, you could start over like the phoenix and, I know what you're saying. You're not wrong, but get out of here now. Leave me be. Peter started to argue, but his words withered at the sight of her sitting so still, head so high, tears now rolling down her neck. He wrapped the sorceress's controls and then climbed down from the hay bales and picked up his crutches. The silence of the barn felt enormous. Okay, he said, just to break it. The walk to the cabin in the dark took forever. Inside, a covered plate rested on the counter. He slumped against the door frame, washed in guilt. Vola had made it up for, page 202, him from the dinner leftovers. You pick this chicken clean later tonight, you hear me? A fresh wave of guilt. She'd killed a chicken, something she didn't do often, because she wanted him to have more protein. Peter shoved off from the door frame and scooped up a box of matches from beside the stove. He had no idea how long she'd stay out there, but when she came back, it wouldn't be to a cold, dark cabin. This much he could do for her. He lit all the lamps and then laid a fire just the way he'd seen Vola do it each night. Sitting there, watching it catch and grow, he replayed everything he'd said. It had all been true. Well, the part about that soldier maybe wanting to be a teacher had probably pushed it, but who knew, maybe he had. No, there wasn't a single thing he hadn't meant to say. Nothing he regretted. A gust blew down the chimney, threatening the fragile fire. He reached for another section of newspaper. As he crumpled it, a headline caught his eye. Forces prepared to engage. Area to be evacuated. He flattened the sheet and read. He studied the map, unbelieving. Page 203, and then he grabbed his crutches and pegged out to the porch so fast that Francois scrambled from his nest and shot out into the night. He jammed his clothes into his pack, then looked around. The phoenix bracelet, the photo of his mother, and his mitt and ball were the only things of his in the room. He propped the bracelet on the hammock where Vola would find it, dropped the other things into the pack, and swung up into the kitchen. Vola was just coming in. She hung her hat on the peg and looked over to the fire, then back at him. At his pack. He handed the sheet of newspaper to her. Vola scanned it, then looked up for an explanation. He pointed at the map. The area they're closing off? He choked. That's only 5 miles from where I left Pax. Are you sure? It's a big area. I'm sure. See this empty place? It's an abandoned rope mill. It's got all these high stone walls, and it sits overlooking the river at the only place you can cross it. The rest is gorge. That's where they'll fight for the water. My friends and I used to play war at that mill. We said it was the perfect place for an ambush. We played war. I left Pax on the road leading up to it, thinking it would be, the word safe stuck in his throat. He shot, page 204, up and lurched over to the pegs at the door to grab his sweatshirt. Stop. They're preparing for battle there. Don't be crazy. It's not crazy. It's right. I know it now. Remember the cheese? You asked what kind I liked, and I didn't know? My father likes cheddar, so that's what we have. Maybe I used to like something else. It's like you said, I had that forgetting who you are disorder. I didn't remember what was right and what was wrong when I left Pax. But now I do. Now I know I need to go there. I know that. All right. Maybe so. But you're still on one leg, boy. It isn't possible. Look at this distance. Vola sat down with the map. No. I've wasted enough time. I'm not listening anymore. Hold on. Vola lifted the paper. You come over here. See something. Peter frowned, but he swung back over. Robert Johnson? Bus driver friend I've been telling you about, who's been mailing your letters. See this spot here? She tapped the top left corner of the map in the article. That town is the final stop on his route. He passes, page 205, through here at 11 Tuesdays and Saturdays, and this is where he pulls up at the end of the night. What if I put you on that bus tomorrow? Seems like that would save you at least 250 miles, leave you about 40 to cover on your own. You listening now? Peter dropped his crutches and sank to the chair, jelly-legged with relief. You'd do that for me? Only 40 miles, that's nothing. No. 40 miles across woods and hills on crutches is not nothing. 3 days at least, I'd figure, and it'll just about kill you. But I think you can do it. So you'll stay the night now? Deal?" Peter took her hand and met her gaze. "Deal." Looking at Vola, her face still tear-streaked from what had happened in the barn, he knew he couldn't leave things as broken as they were. And he didn't have much time to fix them. "Deal," he said again. "On 3 conditions." Page 206. Image. No description. Tee moon shone through the trees as full and creamy yellow as the eggs Pax had eaten a week before. His stomach cramped as he paced the river's edge. Only 3 times in the week and a half since his humans had left him had he eaten a meal big enough to fill his belly, and the last one, a pile of fish rotting on the bank, he dredged up minutes later. He had retrieved the cached ham and watched with pride as Bristle and Runt ate the meat, but he hadn't touched any of it. And he still had had no luck hunting. All his fat reserves were gone. His coat hung loose and he was burning muscle. Page 207. Pax strained his nose to the humans' camp, which, as always, tortured him with its rich food scents. Over the past 2 days more war-sick had arrived, and hundreds of them were massing to the south beyond. The ground vibrated with their threat. But Pax was hungry. He looked over to where Bristle was guarding the sleeping Runt and signaled that he would leave. Although he could see the camp directly above him, he chose his old route, up the gorge and across the ridge, because the guards on the wall were facing the river. He padded up the rocks in the water, leaving no tracks. Away from the silence of the devastated field, his ears pricked toward the night sounds. He knew them now. They comforted him. The thin piping of bats, the careless crashing of a waddling skunk, the underground bustle of voles, the distant calls of owls, all these sounds told him he was not hunting alone. Pax himself made no noise. He had learned the secrets of stealth from Gray and Bristle. Like a shadow, he slipped across the ridge, down the hill, and into the grub tent. No easy meat hung this night, but the tables were piled high with vegetables and breads. He knocked a wheel of cheese to the ground. The taste was strong and, page 208, strange, but he gulped until his belly stretched tight. As he headed back out carrying a hunk for Bristle, a familiar scent stopped him in his tracks. Peanut butter. It was drifting out of a large metal can. Pax dropped the cheese. He stood to sniff at the rim. Like the garbage bin at his boy's home, the can promised a variety of scraps. But above the commingled scents rose the one he craved more than any other. His whiskers ruffled in pleasure. He nudged the lid aside a few inches. The clear jar lay on top of the heap, its sides still smeared thick with the creamy prize. Pax edged his snout under the lid and bit the top of the, page 209, rim carefully. He knew from experience that this was how to grip the jar so it didn't cover his nose. He pushed away from the garbage can. And the lid clattered to the stony ground, ringing an alarm in the quiet night. Image. No description. Pax ducked under the table and froze, his pulse quickened. Across the tent, the flap snapped open. A human stepped in and clicked on a beam of light. Even over the peanut butter, Pax recognized the scent, his boy's father. Pax raised a paw, ready to dart in whatever direction seemed safest. The man swept the light around the tent. When it fell on Pax's eyes, he winced but he didn't move. Page 210, his pupils adjusted, and Pax saw the man crouch to stare at him. Pax remained frozen, paw still raised, jar still clamped in his jaws, studying the man's face as the man studied his. The man grunted, rubbing his chin. Then he gave a rough laugh. Pax lowered his paw an inch, holding the man's gaze, testing him. His boy's father laughed again, then rose and lifted the tent flap. He kicked his boot through the opening. Pax knew the signal. The man had used it on him often at the door of the human's house, at the door of his pen. Go through, it meant. Go through right now and I won't harm you. The pact was reliable. Pax sped past him into the safety of the night. He didn't slow down until he reached the spine of the hill. He buried the jaw and then crouched to watch for movement at the camp in the pre-dawn light. Although he was certain no humans had followed him, he took off east, snaking a loose loop for half an hour before doubling back to drop down to the river. Runt was awake when Pax returned, and for the first time since the explosion, he was struggling to rise. Bristle urged him back down. But Pax saw that his lips were cracked and his eyes, page 211, sunken. He needs water. Bristle looked to the river's edge. A dozen full bounds for a healthy fox. Would it even be possible for Runt? The little fox braced his forelegs. He tightened his haunches to rise, then looked back in surprise. The leg that had been part of him his whole life, as much a part of him as his own scent, was gone. He bent and sniffed at the wound. He looked up at Pax and then Bristle, as if searching for an explanation. Again he strained upward. His one remaining back leg jacked him up, and Runt rolled onto his wounded haunch with a yelp of pain. Pax leaped to stand by his injured side. Runt got to his front legs once more and then straightened his one back leg. Again he canted over. This time, though, he fell against the strong tall flank of the older fox, and he did not cry out. He wobbled, searching for a new balance. When he found it, Pax took a single step toward the water, then waited. Runt stepped out. First, the two front legs. Then a dragging hop with the single back leg. And a collapse against Pax. Page 212. Again Pax took a single step. Again the small fox matched it. And again. And once more, until he didn't waver at all. Bristle ran ahead to the bank. And step by wounded step, Runt closed the distance until he flopped down by the riverbank and stretched his neck out to lap at the cool water. When he was sated, he dropped his head, his eyes closing. But Bristle nipped him. Soon it would be full daylight. He would be exposed. She ran upriver to a stand of cattails. Runt limped after her. He was still clumsy and trembling and slow, but he did not fall once. Pax followed close by. Just as they reached the stand of reeds, Pax startled at the crackling of brush from downstream. Bristle's head snapped around, too, ears cocked to the same spot across the river. Something large was coming. Runt dipped his head to sniff at a snail. Pax and Bristle backed into the cattail reeds. Bristle called to her brother. Runt did not turn his head. A buck pranced out of the vegetation, tossed his antlers, then splashed into the river. Bristle barked for her brother again, and again he ignored her. The deer clattered up onto the other bank, heading for, page 213, the bright grass of an unscorched area of field. At its edge, he lifted a hoof. As he set it down, the earth rocked and the bright grass blew. The buck burst up, his back twisting and snapping. Runt screamed his terror at the quaking ground. Bristle and Pax herded him into the cool dark of the reeds and soothed him until he understood that he was unharmed. The foxes watched the soldiers run down the hill, sweep their beams of light over the heap in the field, then go back. As a pink sun rose over the pines, vast patches of grass in the field flared up and crackled. Field mice stumbled out toward the cool safety of the riverbank. Dazed and disoriented, they would have made easy meals, but Bristle let them pass, as if obeying some code that protected those so terrified. She stood and gazed over the smoking field. "We have to leave here. Now." Pax knew that she was right. He followed her out of the reeds. Bristle called to Runt, who was watching a wandering vole. He didn't even flick his ears toward his sister. And Pax understood. He can't hear. 214, Hen Peter came into the kitchen. He found Vola already drinking coffee. She couldn't have slept any more than he had. He'd heard her leave for the barn in the middle of the night, and she hadn't come back until nearly dawn. She raised her mug. "Breakfast before you go?" He shook his head. Vola nodded and took his pack from him. She stuffed a brown paper bag into it. "Eat the ham sandwiches first, ham won't keep. There's a jar of salve, put it on twice a day. I filled your thermos, but you'll have to be on the page 215, look out for springs. Keep that cask dry, though. I mean it. Tape a garbage bag around it if it rains. She set the pack down and Peter noticed she had 2 shoes on. Hey. You're wearing it. She lifted her overall cuff. Condition number 1. Wow, Peter managed after a minute. Holy diableman. Where's the old one? Vola tipped her head to the armchair. I don't know what to do with it. Maybe put it on the scarecrow. Not on the scarecrow, Peter answered, instantly sure. He pointed to the fireplace. The phoenix, remember? All his stuff burns in the nest. Vola sighed, but she followed him. Peter stirred the embers and added some kindling. Vola brought the wooden post over. It looked smaller somehow. The leather straps reminded Peter of the ones binding the marionette's feet and hands. You okay? I'm okay. Vola placed the wooden leg onto the flames, and both of them watched until it caught. Vola walked away first. Peter noticed how smooth her gait was with the prosthesis. You wouldn't even guess. He pulled the page 216 screen over the fire. When she got home today, there'd be nothing but a pile of ashes. You okay with the other 2 conditions? He asked, trailing her to the kitchen. We'll find out at the library. But I loaded the tractor already. The tractor? How else are we going to cart 20 marionettes into town? We're driving to the library on a tractor. We're driving to the library on a tractor. Unless you've got a magic carpet you haven't told me about. And we have to leave soon to make that bus, so, you're ready? Yeah. I've got everything I need. Well, not quite, you don't. She reached behind the door and drew out something that surprised Peter so much, he couldn't respond. You know what it is, right? The baseball bat was turned perfectly smooth, the weight so solid and balanced that the world seemed to slow as he hefted it. You made this. But I don't need. I think you do. Maybe when you get where you're going, you'll figure out why. Page 217, Peter raked to hand the bat back. But Vola had stayed up last night carving it for him, and she looked so proud. Maybe it was time to own one again. He balanced on his crutches and took a slow-motion swing. And the other bad memory swept him. His 7-year-old fury. A wildness he couldn't control. The exhilarating fright of that wildness. His mother's blue-gazing globe, batted off its pedestal into a million shards. Her tears, you've got to tame that temper. Don't be like him. Her bloodied fingers, picking the blue glass daggers from her white roses. His shame as he watched her drive away. He slid the bat into his pack, where it fit as though it had always had a place there. Treacherous. He hoisted the pack. Underneath was the newspaper clipping. He picked it up, and his eye caught the date. He crumpled to the chair, got kicked. What? He knew. Peter shoved the clipping across the table. He knew. This is 12 days old. So my father knew this when we left Pax. It hurt to take a breath, like knives to his lungs. When I asked to leave Pax on that old mill road because it would be safe, he knew. Page 218. Peter's hands burned. He looked down. They were balled into tight fists. He forced them open. How could he have done that? Vola came over, eyeing him carefully. I'm sorry. That's a very bad thing. His jaw clenched. Could teeth shatter? He forced it open. How could anyone have done that? I know you're angry. Peter's fists had balled up again, the nails gouging his sore palms. He jammed them between his knees. No. I told you. I don't get angry. I'm not like him. I won't be like him. Vola sat down across from him. Oh. I see. I see now. But I don't think that's going to work out. You're human, and humans feel anger. Not me. Too dangerous. Vola threw back her head and barked her startling laugh. Oh, let me tell you, feelings are all dangerous. Love, hope, hope. You talk about dangerous, eh? No, you can't avoid any of them. We all own a beast called anger. It can serve us. Many good things come of anger at bad things, many unjust things are made just. But first we all have to figure out how to civilize it. Page 219, Peter felt his wiring begin to snap. Just one time, could you not tell me I have to figure something out? Just once, would it kill you to help? Come on, I'm leaving. You've got all this. He waved his hand up to the bulletin board, this wisdom. Would it kill you to send me off with some advice? What, you want me to give you a philosophy bingo card for your trip? Like, when you smell honey in the woods, run because the bear can't be far behind. Yeah. I guess. But for real? Well, for real, I don't have any magic truth to guide you. It's your trip, not mine. But now that you bring it up, I do have a card for you. She pulled one off the board and handed it over. It's blank. It is now. But a trip like this? You will find something to fill it with. A truth of your own, that you discover on your own. At that, Peter felt suddenly exhausted, as if he'd been holding himself rigid for years. He had been on his own for so long. Vola studied him. Oneness is always growing in the world, boy. Two but not two. It's always there, connecting. Page 220, its roots, humming. I can't be part of it, that's the price I pay for taking myself away. But you can be. You can vibrate with its heartbeat. You may be on your own. But you won't be alone. What if I get lost? You will not get lost. I think maybe I already am. Vola reached across the table, cupped his head, and pressed. No. You are found. She got up, and Peter felt her brush a kiss on his hair as she passed. The tractor wasn't actually that uncomfortable. But it was slow and bumpy and loud, too loud for them to talk easily, even though Peter was sitting right next to Vola. That was okay with him, he had a lot to think about. Even after they turned onto the smoother highway shoulder, Vola was quiet, and Peter figured she had things on her mind, too. But when she pointed at a hawk wheeling overhead, he remembered something he'd always wanted to ask. What is it with you and birds? The feathers? Vola patted the feathers on her rawhide necklace and smiled. T-pole. When I was born, I reminded my parents of a bird. My hair stuck up like feathers, I had a, page 221, scrawny neck, and I squawked for food all the time. I'm part Creole, part Italian, and part a dozen other things. But all people who revered birds in their cultures, my parents realized. So they named me Vola, it means fly in Italian. But they called me T-pole little chicken. My chickens grace me with feathers, and I wear them to remember that when I was born, someone saw me as a bird. That's all, not much of a story. But it was a good story, Peter thought. And it explained the look she always got on her face when she lifted the rock. It would be the hardest for her to give away. He looked behind him at the 4 crude pine crates the marionettes were packed in, strapped to the back. Peter hoped they didn't remind Vola of coffins. Her amazing puppets were going to live now. Really live, out in the real world, not just exist to perform as some kind of penance. And maybe Vola would, too. But maybe that was too much to ask. He was still wondering about that when the tractor sputtered to a stop in the library parking lot, hunkering over 3 spaces. Vola climbed down and hoisted one of the boxes. Peter followed her, but at the wide brick steps he stopped and, page 222, tapped Vola's shoulder. You know, he whispered, you have to be a little careful in there. Careful? About language, you know. Vola looked at him blankly. He was going to have to spell it out for her. It isn't the kind of place where people say diableman a lot. Oh, please. I think I know that, boy. Her tone was withering, but it held the hint of a grin. Peter opened the door and swept her through. The librarian looked like a tossed handful of jewels, bright coral scarf, gold silk blouse, sapphire blue skirt. She smiled as Vola came in and set her crate on a table, and when the top was lifted, Her mouth fell into a perfect O. Peter remembered he'd been speechless, too, the first time he'd seen those puppets. He backed out the door to give Vola some privacy. The morning's clouds had lifted, and the sky was so bright that it hurt his eyes. The sounds seemed brighter than usual, too, or maybe it was just because things had been so quiet this past week. A barking dog, two women chatting, bike brakes squealing, children shrieking in a playground beside the parking lot. He had missed these, page 223, sounds. He had missed the world. He wondered if Vola missed it all the time. He headed over to watch the little kids playing for a few minutes. Most of them were tearing around, jumping onto and off benches and slapping the swings in some kind of made-up game. A frowning girl with a straw-colored ponytail was digging by herself in a sandbox, earnestly moving shovelful after shovelful from one pile to another. Sitting on the sandbox corner, looking bored, with his head propped in a baseball glove, was a boy in a faded red t-shirt. The shortstop. From the ball practice. Peter moved closer. "Hey." The boy looked up, then stood, as if readying for a fight. He nodded at Peter's crutches. "I wondered why you didn't show." "How did you do?" The shortstop scoffed. "Like you don't know you creamed us." He took the little girl's shovel and handed her a pink sweatshirt. "Come on. Let's go home." "Wait." Peter felt a crazy rising panic. Maybe being a hermit for a week had made him weird already. But the boy was lifting his sister out of the sandbox and they, page 224, were going to leave, and he couldn't let that happen yet. "Wait. You know when you're on the field and you know what you're supposed to do, and you're ready? When the game's about to start and the glove turns into part of your hand, and you know you're exactly where you should be. That feeling? Do you think that's peace?" The boy scowled at Peter. He shook his head as if he wanted to shake off the whole encounter, and then started walking away, pulling his sister by the hand. Peter could only watch as they left the playground, feeling that something valuable had just slipped away. At the gate, though, the shortstop turned. He was pretty far away, but it looked like maybe he wasn't frowning anymore. He lifted a hand and shot two fingers up in a peace sign. Peter lifted his own fingers back. Inside, the librarian was unpacking the last crate. Half a dozen kids had materialized, and they gaped and grinned as she lifted out each marionette. Vola stood off to the side, watching. She turned to leave when she caught sight of Peter. Peter stabbed out a crutch to block her. "Condition number 3? He asked with a glance back to the librarian. Page 225. Vola gave him a look that was half irritation, half grudging defeat. She turned back to the librarian. "I forgot to say, B, that I'll come back once a week. To teach the kids how to use them." B. Booker smiled, a slow smile that reminded Peter of melted caramel. "That'd be awfully nice." Vola set out for the door, but Peter blocked her path again. Vola threw her palms up. "What now?" He raised two fingers. "What? Oh, fine." She walked back to the table. "B. Twice a week. I'll come twice a week, teach the kids." The librarian broke out into a wide grin. "The children would love that. Be good to see you more, too, Vola. Maybe we could go for that coffee afterward." A little girl with a fountain of beaded pigtails tugged on Vola's overalls. She pointed to the elephant. "How do you make him dance?" she demanded. Peter held his breath. But instead of lecturing the girl about figuring things out for herself, Vola crouched down to study the elephant. Peter noticed that the movement was smoother with the prosthesis. She had an ankle joint, page 226, now, such a simple thing, to be able to flex. How much she had given up. "What makes you think he wants to dance?" Vola asked. "Red toenails, like mine." The little girl wiggled her toes in her sandals. Then her hand drifted up to stroke the feathers at Vola's neck. Vola startled at the touch, and Peter held his breath again. But she only reached out and patted the girl's own necklace of yellow pop beads. Then she pointed to the clock over the desk, which read almost 11. "I've got something important to do right now, but I'll be back in half an hour. If you're still here, we'll figure out how to make him dance." By the time they grabbed Peter's pack and crossed the street, the bus was already idling at the station. While Vola went to the ticket counter, Peter made his way to the group waiting to board. A shiver of current scurried up his spine. It was the same thrill that juiced him every time an umpire called, "Play ball." Vola handed Peter the ticket. Lying in his hand, it looked too small for the power it contained. "I'm going to, page 227, get there, and I'm going to find him. Thank you." The bus door cranked open and Vola leaned in. She pointed a warning finger at the driver. "Robert, this boy is family. He's been visiting and now he's going home. You see that he gets there safe and sound." She stepped away, and an elderly couple began their shaky climb aboard. Peter shifted his backpack and crutches. He took a step toward the bus. Then he turned back. "I'm family? That's as true a thing as I've ever known. Now get on that bus." The steps were tall, but Peter hoisted himself up with ease. He took a seat up front and gave Vola a thumbs up through the grimy glass. He was strong now. He was prepared. But when the air brakes hissed their release, he gripped the armrest. It was going to hurt a lot to watch her getting smaller and smaller. Vola motioned for him to slide the window open when the bus growled into gear. "Boy," she called up as it lurched away from the curb, "I'm going to leave the porch door open." Page 228. Image. No description. P. Axtug. Since moving Runt up the gorge, Pax and Bristle had taken turns guarding him, a pact of protection. They would be his strong hind legs, they would be his ears. Runt was safe and sleeping inside the abandoned groundhog's den that Bristle had enlarged for him. Still, Pax felt anxious. Something was coming. He dug as he kept watch in front of the burrow. The pads of his paws were toughened. They did not bleed. When Bristle returned from hunting, she dropped a chipmunk in front of him. Pax turned away, although, page 229, he had not eaten since the cheese 2 nights before. He would not take food from Bristle or Runt. Bristle buried the chipmunk and then stretched out beside the den for her watch. Pax left to pace the perimeter of the clearing again. The location was good, although it was near the encampment. It was high enough above it to feel safe from the exploding earth down near the river. Juniper bushes ringing the clearing would provide cover. More important, they would help disguise the fox's scents. A short distance away, a clear spring trickled from a cleft rock, and the grass was full of game. But something was wrong. Something was coming. Pax bounded the short distance through the trees to the ridgeline above the encampment. The encounter with his boy's father had left him too wary to attempt another raid. But at the same time he was more drawn to the camp. The man's motion, that sweeping kick of his boot through the doorway with its conflicting messages of goodwill and threat, had reminded him that he needed to protect his boy. And if the man lived at the camp, surely Peter would find his way there soon. Page 230. It was mid-afternoon. Pax watched the Warsick spread out along the river bank, rolling more wires, digging more holes, and burying more dark boxes under the hot sun. The odor of their sweat was spiked with a new aggression. The danger he sensed was more immediate than that, though. It was more primitive. He ran back and paced the clearing again. When he saw Runt emerge blinking from the den, Pax hurried over to examine him. No blood seeped from the wound, and it smelled clean. Runt ignored the meal Bristle dug up for him. Pax could see that he was thirsty. "I will take him to the spring." Bristle began to follow, but then she sat back down and merely watched intently as they left. When they returned, Runt tumbled back into the den. Pax settled himself in front of it. The groundhog's burrow entrance felt too large, too open, and he felt better when he kept guard there, but Bristle called, "Come with me. Watch." She picked her way into the grass, paw over silent paw, head low and cocked to the ground. Pax followed as carefully. In the middle of the clearing she stopped short, ears perked forward, and shot a quick glance back at him. Page 231. Pax heard it. A light scurrying under the netting of dried grass that matted the ground. Bristle tracked it as if she could see its movement. Then she sprang into the air and jacked straight down, paws over her nose, and emerged with a mouse in her jaws. She ate it in a few bites and then angled back across the clearing, searching again. She dropped to her haunches, head cocked to her left. "Now you." Pax listened until he felt sure he had located the tunneling rustle. A high leap, and then he tucked his paws over his nose to dive just as Bristle had. He landed hard. No mouse. He turned away from Bristle to huff out the dirt. Bristle stalked off. Pax followed, his head hanging, until she perked her ears toward another faint scurrying. Again she backed away while Pax tried the pounce. Again no mouse. Bristle studied Pax as he pawed the dirt from his cheeks. "Follow me." Pax padded behind her until she stopped abruptly and dropped to a crouch. Before them was a hole in the thatch. It was warm with the fresh scent of many mice. Bristle warned him to stay back. "Don't move. Watch." Page 232. Bristle crept forward. In front of the hole she dropped and laid her head on her paws. She closed her eyes to slits, and her whole body relaxed, as if in deep sleep. Pax was surprised. He had thought she was still teaching him to hunt. He stood. Bristle tabbed a warning with her singed tail. "Stay." Pax settled again. For many moments, nothing happened. Then Pax caught the faintest stirring at the opening of the warren. A quivering nose tested the air, then retreated. Another long moment, and the mouse reappeared. Its movements were so light, so alert, that Pax knew it was a whisker away from flight. Bristle didn't stir, except for the flicker of an eyelid as she cut a warning glance at Pax. The mouse emerged and retreated twice more. Then, assured that the fox was asleep, it made a run for cover. Bristle's swift paw swept out and raked the doomed mouse to her jaws. Pax understood. Bristle retreated to guard Runt, and Pax trotted into the clearing, eager to find the telltale hole that would allow him to try the move himself. He found one beside a rotting log and drew in the thick scents of a colony of field mice. He settled himself a four-legs reach away. Page 233. His excitement made it hard to stay perfectly still, but at last a mouse came to the entrance and tested the air. Like Bristle's quarry, the mouse started back in at the sight of the fox. Like Bristle's quarry, it re-emerged until it was convinced Pax was asleep and then made a run for it. Pax wasn't as quick as Bristle. But he managed to knock the mouse over, and as it scrambled to its feet, he swiped again. And caught his first prey. It was a small meal, but each bite sent a hot current through Pax's body. The mouse's life now merged with his own. His muscles brimmed with energy. He sprang up and tore a joyful path around the clearing, running by Bristle in a blaze of red fur. She got to her feet to watch. Pax sped by again, scarcely skimming the ground, but it wasn't celebration enough. In the center of the clearing stood an old, crooked sweet gum tree. Its lowest limbs reached out over a hollow, its upper branches glinted blue with feeding jays. Pax flew at the trunk. He scrambled easily onto the first low branch and balanced there. Then step by cautious step, he began to walk along its length. Leaves rustled around him in welcome like fragrant green stars. Through them, he looked down in, page 234, astonishment. The world had changed. From this vantage point he could see through the ridgeline trees to the encampment and the river in the distance. The meadow grasses, which just a moment ago had brushed his shoulders, now seemed flattened to a broad green bowl. Jays flew down to scold him. Pax recalled Runt's flight. He coiled himself. Then sprang, stretching out and out, feeling the air ruffle his belly fur. He landed lightly and threw his head back and barked his happiness. This new world was his. He could travel through it, and he could feed himself on its bounty whenever he wanted. He was part of it all, free. But not alone. Pax hurried to where he'd buried the peanut butter jar and unearthed it. He carried it back and dropped it in front of Bristle and Runt, who were drowsing at the burrow entrance in the last rays of afternoon sun. Both of them came alive instantly at the strange scent. Bristle was on her feet first. She nudged the jar and jumped back at its surprising roll. She sniffed it all around and tested it with her tongue. One taste was all it took. Bristle locked the jar between her paws and began lapping greedily, cleaning out the top half, page 235, in seconds. She squirmed her snout in deeper. Pax had done this same thing. Be careful. You can get trapped. Too late. Bristle jumped up. She thrashed her head from side to side, but the jar was wedged on tightly. She hopped onto her hind legs, trying with both forepaws to claw it off, and tumbled over and over. Runt watched in amazement. His sister had never lost her composure before. Pax approached, offering to help. But Bristle dashed away. She would do this herself. Finally, she rolled onto her back and pried the jar off her face with her hind legs. She shook herself and stalked back, her head and tail high. She dropped down beside Pax and began cleaning herself. Bristle had never sat this close to him before, with her flank pressed comfortably against his own. Her scent had never been this friendly. A streak of brown on Bristle's white cheek caught his attention. Without thinking of the consequences, he stretched out and licked it off. And Bristle allowed it. Pax cleaned her ears and her throat and her muzzle. And after a moment, Bristle returned the care. Cheek to cheek, the two foxes groomed each other. Bristle stopped, page 236, to sniff Pax deeply. You don't smell of humans now. Pax didn't respond. He got to his feet to test the air. Something dangerous had entered the clearing with the dusk. An animal scent he didn't recognize but feared. It was gone as quickly as it had appeared, but Pax howled at Runt. Get inside the den. Now. 237, Kid. Peter twisted around so sharply, he nearly fell over. He'd been certain the guard station was empty. He'd watched for 10 full minutes to make sure before leaving his cover. A soldier came out from behind a truck. He lifted his rifle butt to the sign chained over the barricade. No entry. Peter straightened up as tall as he could on his crutches. It had been 2 days since he'd spoken to anyone. 2 days since the bus driver had said, I don't, page 238, know what you're really up to, son, but I doubt it's a good idea. You want, I can get you on a bus back tonight. No shame in that, and Peter had replied, no thanks, because there would have been shame in turning back, and then the bus driver had said, all right then, good luck, and let him out. Not a soul had spoken to him that night. The town was on the perimeter of the evacuated area, and the few people he passed cast their eyes down, picked up speed, as if they couldn't afford to make contact with anyone who might need help. Nothing extra here, their looks said. All is already lost. The next day, from sunrise to well past sunset, and most of this morning, he had traveled on roads through vacant towns, past abandoned schools and playgrounds and neighborhoods spookily silent without their squeaking tricycles, their car radios, their pickup ball games. The only familiar sound had been water running through garden hoses when he'd filled his thermos. He hadn't seen any other humans, but he'd seen the animals they'd left behind. A skittish pony, tugging up grass in front of a church. Dogs eyeing him balefully from behind dumpsters. Dozens of skinny cats, sliding away, page 240, their flanks hollow as spoons. Image. No description. Hey, kid. The soldier moved closer. He eyed Peter's handmade crutches, the rough cast, the dirty clothes. We evacuated this area almost 2 weeks ago. Where have you been? You don't know that. I know that. But I left someone down there. I'm going to get him. Take it easy. We checked the records, everyone's out. He is not a person. Peter jutted his chin, defying the soldier to argue that this mattered. Instead, the soldier's face changed, became somehow younger, and Peter saw that he wasn't that long out of high school. He slid his rifle back into its sling. "I have a dog. Henry." He didn't say anything else for a minute, just looked down the road, as if he were hoping this dog of his would suddenly appear. Then he turned back and sighed. "I don't think anyone's walking him. My sister said she'd do it, but she works. Want to see his picture?" Even before Peter nodded, the soldier had drawn out his wallet. He held out a picture. A beagle. An ordinary beagle. Peter's throat hurt. The corners of the photo were worn soft and colorless. That picture had been taken out a lot. Page 241, "That's Henry. I got him for my 8th birthday. His hips are bad now, but he still likes his walk, you know. Still likes to sniff out squirrels and stuff. I told my sister that, but Henry won't understand where I've gone, is the thing. He'll wait at the door all day for me. What's yours look like? I'll keep an eye out for him." "Pax isn't a..." Peter stopped. If it didn't matter that Pax wasn't a human, why should it matter that he wasn't a dog? He's red. Black legs. "How big?" "Coyotes out here. They have pups this time of year. They'll take down a small dog when they have a litter to protect." "He's pretty small." Peter shifted his weight off his blistered palms. "Please. I've come a long way to do this." The soldier gazed at his photo another minute before slipping it into his wallet. When he looked back at Peter, he seemed older again. "We're holding them. But they're coming. You go in, you've got to be back out by tomorrow." He pointed at Peter's crutches. "You can do that?" "I can. So, you'll let me through?" The soldier looked around and leaned in. "This road is patrolled hourly, but we only guard the main trail entrances. No one is stationed in the woods yet. You travel, page 242, 20 yards in, no one would stop you. But listen, if you get caught, I didn't just say that. Now get out of here." "Thanks." Peter turned and started for the woods before the soldier could change his mind. "Kid. I hope you find him." It was quiet in the woods, but here the quiet was right, and it was broken by the sound of wild things, which seemed a promise. Here, Peter could imagine seeing Pax's red brush flicking between the trees. Here, when he called, it was easy to imagine an answering bark. These things raised his spirits so much that he could almost ignore the pain in his palms and in his armpits, bleeding and raw. For an hour he pegged over ground that was so springy with decades of fallen pine needles, it seemed to lift him. When he heard the rough growl of a jeep, he ducked behind some brush until it passed. After that, he walked along the road's edge, sure that when another patrol went by, he'd have enough warning to take cover. And then he was there. It wasn't a landmark he recognized, or the way the road straightened out of its curve. It was the sense of betrayal that hung all around. He'd done something terrible here, page 243, and the place remembered. "Pax." He called, not caring if anyone heard him. Let the jeeps come, let a whole army come. He wasn't leaving without his fox. "Pax." Against his shouts, the silence grew only deeper. Ominous now, not promising. He started along the road again, calling and keeping his eyes to the gravel shoulder. He was sure Pax had had the toy soldier in his mouth when the car had peeled away. Whenever Pax had given up on Peter, he would have dropped it. Peter wanted to hold it in his hand again, a solid proof that his fox had been here. He walked a quarter mile, a half mile, eyes down. And then he stopped short. He wasn't going to find that toy soldier. Because Pax wouldn't have given up. Not ever. Pax would never have thought he'd been abandoned, they were inseparable. Pax had known it all along. Peter was the one who'd had to learn it. If Pax wasn't here, he must have gone home to find Peter, or tried. Maybe the river would have blocked him, but maybe not. Dogs made it home against crazy odds all the time. Pax was 10 times smarter than any dog, so why wouldn't he be able to find his way? Maybe he was there right now. Page 244, Home. Home was about 10 miles southeast of the old mill. and the mill was probably 4 or 5 miles south of where he was right now. So he'd head south, calling for Pax all the way. The gorge beside the mill would be too dangerous to navigate in the dark, so he'd sleep there, then make the descent at dawn. He would cross the river where it widened out at the mill, and then after another 10 miles of trails that he knew, he'd be home. "Hold on," he said out loud. "I'm coming." Description: 245, Pax woke with a start. His boy was near. He jumped to his feet, waking Bristle, who had been dozing beside him, and began to search the clearing for Peter's scent. Nothing. But he was near. Pax bolted through the trees to the ridge above the encampment. He saw no youth among the war-sick. He did not hear Peter's voice among the murmurs and shouts. He crept down the hill and circled the camp as close as he dared, scenting from all directions. His boy was not there. Page 246. But he was near. And he was coming. Pax returned to Bristle's side and lay down. But he did not sleep. Image. No description. 247. Peter traveled south for almost an hour, feeling certain that Pax had traveled the same route. But when he emerged from the woods, he stopped. A vast meadow sloped down for at least a mile before flattening into another mile of wide green floor. At the base of that, the land rose hundreds of feet in jagged steps, as if chopped with a giant hoe. And beyond that, rolling to the horizon, was the forested plateau that hid the gorge. Since waking, he'd traveled 9 hours without thinking of rest once, but now the stunning immensity of the distance ahead drained what was left of his energy. Page 248, he dropped his pack and fell to the ground. 9 hours of gripping the crutch handles had stiffened his hands to claws. He forced them open and felt the raw palms split. They'd blistered the day before, broken open, and blistered again. He poured cool water from his thermos over the hot pulp of his palms and set to work picking out shreds of tire rubber. Then he eased his extra pair of socks over his hands and looked out again. A movement halfway down the valley caught his eye. Something trotted in bouncing dips between 2 trees. Fox movement. Peter rose to his knees. Pax. There it was again. But no, whatever was there was tan, not red. Coyote, maybe. The thought was a shot of adrenaline, and suddenly he was moving again, pack slamming against his back, crutches pistoning down the hill all the way to the valley bottom in just half an hour and then sinking into the boggier ground there, muddy and slower but still moving. And then a 10-foot sheer rock wall loomed in front of him. The cliffs were a lot taller than they had appeared from across the valley. Before he could second-guess himself, Peter hurled his pack and then his crutches up and heard them clatter, page 249, onto a stony ledge. He wedged his fingers into a crevice and pulled. His cast scraped along the rough rock face, but his arms were strong from Vola's draining, and he levered himself onto a shallow foothold. From there, he reached for a jutting tree, then another crack in the rock, and then he heaved himself over the first ledge. It took an hour to climb the stepped rise that way, crutches and pack first and dragging himself after. When he reached the crest, panting and sweat-soaked, he fell to the ground under a tall pine. He drained his thermos in one swallow and ate the last of the ham sandwiches. He opened Vola's second packet. Peanut butter. Peter's throat closed. He remembered the first time Pax had found an empty jar in the trash. He'd squeezed his snout in so deep, it had gotten stuck, and Peter had laughed until it hurt. He stuffed the sandwich back into the bag, wishing he'd found it the day before, and tossed it to the dogs scavenging the dumpsters, and got up again. It was almost 6 o'clock, and he had a ways to go still. As he traveled, the memories of those hungry-eyed animals accompanied him, darting and retreating like accusing ghosts. He wished he could tell them that he knew how it felt to have the one person who had loved you, page 250, and taken care of you suddenly vanish. How the world suddenly seemed dangerous after that. He had lost a parent. How many kids this week, he wondered, had woken up to find their worlds changed that way, their parents gone off to war, maybe never coming home. That was the worst, of course. But what about the smaller losses? How many kids missed their older brothers or sisters for months at a time? How many friends had had to say goodbye? How many kids went hungry? How many had had to move? How many pets had they had to leave behind to fend for themselves? And why didn't anyone count those things? People should tell the truth about what war costs, Vola had said. Weren't those things the costs of war, too? With a start, Peter found that the dark was falling around him. A little panicked, he should have been looking for a good place to settle for the night. He spun around. His left crutch shot out onto a patch of loose stones. He fell onto it hard and heard a crisp snap. For an instant he feared drib. But the sound had been wood. He landed, still gripping the top of the crutch. 6 feet away was its bottom shank. Diableman. It came out naturally, a satisfying word. Page 251, he tried out some other swears, and they felt pretty good, too. But the way the darkening woods absorbed his shouts without a response made him uneasy, so he stopped. He didn't have the luxury of venting, anyway. He had a crutch to repair and not much light left. All around him, trees shot out hardwood limbs that he could tape to the broken pieces as a splint. But he had no hatchet to cut them. As he drew the bat out of his pack so he could find the tape, he realized that the solution was in his hand. He aligned the crutch pieces, laid the bat over them, then began winding the tape. When he was finished, he tested the crutch with his full weight. It held, strong and solid. He wished he could tell Vola she'd been right, he had needed her bat on his journey. He knelt by his pack again. The accident had been warning enough. He pulled out the things he needed to make camp for the night, then scraped a bowl in the dirt and filled it with a pile of twigs and dried grass. He touched a match to it, and a little fire crackled to life. Peter held his jackknife over the flames until he figured it was sterilized, then gritted his teeth and slit open the new blisters that had formed on his palms. The pain made, page 252, him gasp. But he eased on some of Vola's salve and took deep breaths until it numbed. The herb smell swept him back to her kitchen with a rush, and he wondered if she was there now. How was she managing without that heavy leg to anchor her? Before he put his knife away, he held it up. The last of the firelight danced along its blade. He remembered the first time he'd seen Vola's knife, how shocked he'd been when she had gouged a chip of wood off her leg. Peter tugged up his jeans. He pressed the flat of the knife against his calf and tried to imagine slicing off a nugget of flesh because it offended him, because it wasn't perfect. A coyote howled then, and a second answered from a distance. Peter shivered. He turned the blade until the cool edge creased his flesh, then jerked it up. The slice was only half an inch, but its sting was fierce. There were advantages, he could see, to being made of wood. The cut beaded up. As the dark blood began to drip, he drew it into the shape of a leaping fox. With his fingernail, he pricked out a pointed nose, then 2 ears. A wild smear of his thumb for the brush. Pax. Tomorrow. A red fox blood vow. 253, teary mice swelled Pax's belly and a muskrat dangled from his mouth, his first large prey. It would feed Bristle and Runt for the whole day. He craved sleep after a long night of hunting, but as usual he'd trotted a long weaving path home to confuse any possible predators. The trail the bleeding Runt had left when they'd moved was still strong enough to mark them as vulnerable. The first rays of morning light lit the grasses. A movement caught his eye. Bristle. She was a few full bounds out in the clearing instead of at the apron of the burrow, where she usually guarded Runt. He watched her, page 254, bounce up in mock alarm and then tumble kicking into the grass. Then he saw an even more surprising sight. Runt's small head bobbed up. Runt was outside. And he was playing. Pax dropped the muskrat. He called to Bristle. And Runt turned his head. Pax called again, testing. And Runt answered. He could hear. Pax was washed with a relief so overwhelming that he could not move for a moment. Where he had once cared for only one boy, he now brimmed with love for this bristling vixen and her ragged brother. And they were safe. He streaked across the clearing. Bristle and Runt parted to welcome him into the space between them. He dropped onto his back, and Runt toppled onto him. Pax rolled Runt over gently, listening for any whimper of pain, and heard only purrs of delight. For an hour the foxes played. Runt rested often, and whenever he did, the other two stopped and flanked him. Like the buttercups beside them, their 3 fox faces lifted to the morning sun. Until Bristle leaped to her feet, her nostrils flared. Pax smelled it, too. The same threatening scent that, page 255, had made him anxious for 2 days. But this was no longer a faint thread in the air. This odor was strong and growing stronger. Coyote. Bristle jumped toward the den, pivoted toward the clearing, then jumped back to Runt. Pax had never seen her so panicked. At that instant, all 3 foxes perked their ears sharply to the same spot in the woods. To the careless branch rustling of a creature that did not need the advantage of stealth. Heading north, up from the gorge. Heading for the clearing. The coyote was following Runt's trail. Bristle nosed her brother upright and screamed at Pax, "Guard him!" Pax herded Runt back into the den. Pacing the entrance, he watched Bristle head toward the rustling, stiff-legged and wary, and then stop. She pricked her ears, her rump high. And then in front of her, at the precise place where the junipers were still compressed from dragging Runt in, a dark brindle coyote emerged, his head to the ground. Bristle barked. The coyote's head snapped up. Bristle barked again and jumped into the clearing. The coyote cocked his head and took a step toward, page 256, her. Then he lowered his nose to Runt's trail again. Deep instinct urged Pax to run away. The coyote was a tall, heavily muscled male. A fox was no match for an animal that large and aggressive. But a deeper instinct reminded him that Runt was defenseless in the burrow. Bristle ignored the instinct to flee as well. Instead, she tore straight toward the coyote, lunging at his flank. The coyote spun and snapped, just clipping Bristle's back foot. She limped into the clearing, whining as if she'd been injured. The coyote studied her, but then he shook himself, recognizing the ploy, and dropped to the scent again. Bristle flew back. She jumped in front of the coyote's path and faced him, her spine arched. From her throat came the hoarse howl Pax had never heard before. For an instant, the coyote pulled back, seeming surprised that the small fox was engaging him. Then he bunched his shoulders into attack position and bared his teeth. Pax's body stiffened. A growl rattled in his throat. Runt whimpered in the den. The coyote sprang at Bristle and knocked her to the ground. For a moment, Pax saw nothing but fur and teeth flashing in the grass and heard only yips and growls. But, page 257, then Bristle scrambled out of the coyote's hold. She leaped again toward the center of the clearing. A single leap only. Pax understood that she was luring him away from Runt. Staying just out of his reach, she baited the coyote until she reached the sweet gum tree. Then, just as Pax had done, she leaped up onto the slant of the trunk. She padded out onto the low first branch carefully, never taking her eyes off the growling coyote who followed on the ground. When she reached the spot where the branch split, she was well over his head. She hissed a taunt. The coyote jumped. He clawed only bark and leaves. He circled in the hollow under the branch, looking for higher ground, and then jumped again. This time his forepaws caught the branch and held for an instant before he fell back. He gathered himself and leaped again. Pax saw that Bristle was as far out on the limb as she could go. The coyote would tear her from the tree soon, or grow impatient with her distractions and return to the trail she diverted him from. She would follow and fight until he ripped her apart. "Stay," Pax ordered Runt. And he tore across the clearing. Page 258. Image. No description. Peter stared. There'd been a birch tree by the upper walls of the mill. He and his friends had named it the pirate tree because in the fall, bright yellow leaves made it look covered in gold coins. He'd tied packs to its trunk once when the kid hadn't liked their war play. The pirate tree was still standing, but now only blackened wisps tattered its branches. Nothing else, except the mill itself, was recognizable. All the trees in the lower field were gone, uprooted and blasted to splintered logs. Great patches of grasses, page 259, around them were scorched to ash. The bank was littered with the crow-picked remains of perch and crayfish and turtles and frogs. What hurt most to look at was the water. The last time he'd been here, he'd dived into the pool at the base of the gorge. The water had been so sparkling and clear that he'd been able to see the pale green shafts of the reeds, the iridescent scales on the trout, and even, when he looked up, the sheer blue nets of dragonfly wings skimming the surface. He might have been swimming through liquid diamonds. Now muddy boulders clogged the river, and the pool was a dull brown ring. The broad flat of the river was half its usual breadth. Mud flats near the banks, caking to dry clay, smelled of death. The water was what the whole war was about. Peter remembered Vola asking him which side his father was fighting on. Peter had answered her, stunned that she would even have to ask. The right side, he'd added, indignantly. Boy, Vola had said, and then boy. Again, to make sure she had his attention. Do you think anyone in the history of this world ever set out to fight for the wrong side? Page 260. The wind picked up and howled across the field, stirring eddies of ash. Peter tried to imagine playing here again. It would be a long time before anyone would ever want to play here. Vultures, wheeling silently above him, were the only living things as far as he could see. With this much devastation, they must have been feasting for days. He watched them, paralyzed by the sadness of the scene. The closest two were circling a hemlock bough near the bank, probably judging the safety of returning to the meal he had interrupted. A meal that might be. Peter couldn't form the thought, but he couldn't erase it either. If Pax had been here, he could be dead now. And if he was, the vultures would lead him to the proof. They hovered over 3 distinct spots, the one beside him and 2 across the river, slow and lazy. In no hurry. Their meals weren't going anywhere. He dropped his pack. Freed of the weight, he swung down to the hemlock bough in only a few steps. Trailing from beneath it was the sight he was dreading. A foxtail, its white-tipped brush unmistakable. He lifted the limb. The fox carcass had been scavenged, but its pelt, page 261, remained. And it wasn't red. It wasn't red. Not Pax. He took a ragged breath. Dizzy with relief, he pegged down to the river and waded in. When he was waist-high, the crutches skidded out on the mud-slime stones, so he speared them over to the far bank and dived in. For the first time in almost 2 weeks, Peter didn't feel hampered by his broken foot. He swam strongly. He pulled himself onto the bank. Out of water, the soaked cast felt like it weighed 100 pounds, the muddy plaster already crumbling. He took his knife out of his pocket and hacked at it until he freed his foot. It hung pale and limp, but the swelling was down and the bruise was almost gone. Peter crawled to his crutches and hitched them under his arms. Upright, he saw what the larger group of vultures was circling, the corpse of a deer. He thought of the doe he'd seen in Vola's field. You humans. You ruin everything, and turned away from the sight. 20 yards up the field, a single vulture hovered over the 3rd spot he'd sighted. Peter climbed, choosing a path where the grasses had been burned, easier going. At first there seemed to be nothing on the chart, page 262, ground. But when he was almost upon it, he saw a hind leg. Fleshless and singed, but still he knew it was a hind leg. A slim, black-furred hind leg with a small white paw. A ragged drift of fur at the top was bright cinnamon. Fox. Peter swayed on his crutches. Maybe it wasn't Pax's. Wasn't it too small to be Pax's? He wished he could know, and then he took back the wish. What did it matter, anyway? A fox had been going about its life here, and some humans had obliterated that life. Wasn't that enough of an outrage? He would scrape the earth with his bare hands and bury the remains. Peter dropped to the ground. He swept a circle bare of rubble, and his hand brushed something that turned the breath in his lungs to ash. A toy soldier, sighting down the barrel of a rifle pressed tight to its hard green cheek, aiming at whatever happened to be in the way. Peter keeled over. Pax. 263. Pax reached the tree just as the coyote sprang again, this time finding enough purchase to hang from the branch. Pax flew at him and bit a mouthful of brindled fur and hung on. The coyote dropped and sank his teeth into Pax's shoulder, all in one motion. Pax jerked free and then back toward the south edge of the clearing, hoping to lead the coyote away from the tree, away from the den, away from the foxes he loved. The coyote didn't follow. He threw back his head and, page 264, barked. Then he turned to eye Bristle again. Pax lowered himself and began to creep back toward the tree. But then he stopped. He swung his head toward a sound from the encampment. His boy's voice? Ahead, the tall coyote barked again, and this time the call was answered. 3 sets of ears cocked at the same spot in the juniper ring. A second coyote trotted out. Another male, this one pale and stocky. He surveyed the scene and broke into a gallop for the tree. Bristle issued another threat yowl and spiked her fur, but Pax saw her eyes roll in terror. The second coyote pawed at the trunk. And then Pax heard it again. His boy, calling his name. He bolted out of the clearing and through the stand of trees. At the ridgeline above the mill, he stopped. Warsick men streamed from the walls, sticks raised, converging on a figure down on the field. It was a black-haired youth, curled on the burned ground. His boy. The wind, blowing from the north, told him nothing. The soldiers stopped, their sticks still menacing. The boy rose. He was tall, but Pax saw that his body didn't, page 265, look like Peter's. This boy's shoulders were thrown wide, and braced under one was a narrow pole. Stranger still, this boy held his head high, not canted downward. He faced the men in defiance, something Pax had never seen Peter do, and raised his fist and shook it at them. A single soldier ran down to the field. This one moved like his boy's father. He shouted, and the voice was familiar. But then the man walked to the boy and embraced him, something Pax had never seen the father do. Were these his humans? Pax tried to scent, but the gusting breeze carried only the musk of enraged coyotes. He turned back for the clearing. 266. Peter let his father hug him. For so many years he had wanted to be in that circle of protective love. He felt his father quake with sobs, and he wanted to reassure him that everything was all right. But it wasn't. His hands stayed clenched, one on the crutch grip, one on the toy soldier. He pulled away. "What are you doing here? You told me you would only be laying wire." And then he understood everything at once. Why the men hadn't advanced. How the grasses had been burned and the trees uprooted and the river strangled with rocks. Page 267, how there could be nothing left of a fox but a single leg. You knew. He shoved the toy soldier into his pocket and picked up the fox leg. You knew. And you did this. Pax. Image. No description. 268. Again Pax thought he heard his boy's voice. He pricked his ears back to the camp. Just then, the wind shifted. Pax smelled the Warsick's sweat, their cordite, their motor fuel, their charred fields. And his 2 humans. He ran back to the ridge. He saw his boy lift something from the ground. A stick, but not a stick. Something furred and broken. The grief-yearning scent rolled up the hill. Fresh and keen, from his boy. But also old and strained, from his, page 269, boy's father. So this scent was not Peter's alone. It was the scent of humans. His boy held the broken thing above his head and cried something angry. And then, Pax. And Pax barked. 270. Peter held what was left of the fox high above his head and called his name again. Pax. And from above the mill, an answering bark. Hope rose in his throat. But no, he must have just wished for that bark. He scanned the ridgeline anyway. A flash of red. A white-tipped brush. A fox appeared in an open spot and rose on his back legs, on two back legs, and looked straight at him. Peter pressed the fox leg into his father's hand. "Bury this." Then he grabbed his other crutch and turned for the hill. "Wait, Peter. You have to understand. It's my duty." Page 271. Peter pointed to the fox on the ridge. He thumped his chest so hard, it hurt. "That's mine." His father shouted to him about wires. He shouted at him to stop. Peter saw the wires. He pulled over them. But he did not stop. Because there was only his fox, waiting on the spine of the hill, and the distance between them. Over and over, he planted his crutches and swung through, closing that distance. When he was almost there, his shirt dried from the wind and then soaked again in sweat. He stopped and called. Pax tossed his head and then bounded away toward the trees. On four legs. Peter was sure of it, Pax was unharmed. Peter followed. But again, just as he neared him, Pax broke away, galloping into the trees. Peter followed again. He didn't begrudge Pax this testing game. He had broken his pet's trust. Why wouldn't he be skittish? Why wouldn't he need to assure himself of Peter's loyalty now? For as long as Pax wanted, Peter would obey. It was fair punishment. Through the trees, 100 long yards and 100 more, Peter followed. And then they broke into a clearing, and the fox stood and waited. Peter reached him. He offered his hand. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Page 272. Pax locked Peter's gaze and then took his wrist in his jaws. Peter's pulse jumped against the bracelet of teeth, pressed just tight enough to claim him. Just tight enough to call to Peter's own wildness. Two but not two. Pax released Peter's wrist and tore across the clearing toward a crooked tree. Circling the tree was a pair of coyotes. Pax lunged at the taller one. "No, Pax. Come back." The tree was so far away, 50 yards at least. Peter dug his crutches into the turf and piked hard. When he was a dozen yards away, he saw the coyote's treed quarry, another fox, bright-furred with a sharp and delicate face, a vixen. She was bleeding from a gash on her haunch, and instead of a thick brush, she thrashed the blackened whip of her tail. The vixen swiped at one of the coyotes from above, taunting him, and Pax snapped at the other's flank. Peter saw that the two foxes were a team. And that they were no match for the coyotes. Peter barreled for the tree, shouting, but the coyotes ignored him. The taller of the two spun around and sank his teeth into Pax's neck. Pax shrieked. And Peter roared in fury. He braced himself on one crutch and leaned back and sidearmed the other, heavy, page 273, with its white ash bat, as hard as he could, aiming in between the two coyotes. Both of them wheeled around at the outrage. While the tree rang with the bat's blow, the tall dark one sprinted away and disappeared into the brush. The other one bolted a dozen yards and then stopped and turned back. He eyed Peter and bared his fangs. Peter bared his teeth back. Pax growled at his side, hackles raised, ready to spring. Peter swept his second crutch over his head and roared again, and Pax snarled and the pale coyote reared back in surprise. He turned and crashed out of the clearing. Peter clutched the tree. He slid to the ground, shaking. Instantly Pax was on him, wriggling under his neck, licking his face, sniffing his broken foot, nuzzling his face again. Peter wrapped his arms around his fox and pressed his face to the piney-smelling fur. "You're okay, you're okay, you're okay." The vixen leaped over them to the ground and disappeared into the juniper scrub ringing the clearing. Pax sat up and barked to her from Peter's lap. After a moment, Peter saw a black muzzle point out from the brush. Out came a skinny fox, about the size Pax had been at, page 275, 8 months, blinking in the sunlight. He stumbled into the clearing on 3 legs. The vixen re-emerged. She paced and yipped at the runty little fox, shooting wary looks at Peter. Image. No description. Pax squirmed out of Peter's arms and barked again. The 3-legged fox took a few steps closer. Its limp was so awkward, Peter realized he must have lost the leg only recently. And then he made the connection. He offered his hand and called softly. Hesitatingly, his gaze darting between Peter and Pax, the little fox hobbled over. He tucked his head under Pax's chin. Peter extended a finger. The injured fox allowed him to brush his neck for an instant, then hurried back to the safety of the vixen's side. Together, the 2 foxes looked expectantly at Pax, and then they melted into the underbrush. And Peter understood. His fox belonged to them. And they belonged to Pax. Inseparable. All this way he'd come. All this way. Peter got to his knees. He placed his hand on Pax's back and felt the muscles jump. Peter looked around. The woods looked dangerous now, full of coyotes and bears and, soon, humans at war. He looked down at his fox, still straining to follow his, page 277, page 276, new family. Go. It's okay. It wasn't, though. The pain scoured him hollow, left him without breath, like a kick to the heart. He pulled his hand away, because Pax would feel a pain that deep and he wouldn't leave. Go. Pax shot away toward the brush line. Then he turned back to look at his boy. Peter felt tears roll down his face, but he didn't wipe them away. Pax sprang back. He whimpered, licking at the tears. Peter pushed him down. He found the crutch and levered himself upright. No. I don't want you to stay. I'll always leave the porch door open, but you have to go. Pax looked toward the brush and then back at his boy's face. Peter dug into his pocket and pulled out the toy. He lifted it. Pax raised his head, his eyes strained on Peter's hand. And Peter hurled the plastic soldier over the brush and into the woods, as far away as he could. Image. No description. 278 Acknowledgements. Red foxes. The more I learned about them, the more I admired them and the more determined I became to portray them with respect. I am indebted to Matthew Walter, a New York State biologist and skilled wildlife tracker who has spent years researching red foxes in the field. Where the fox behavior is accurate, it's because he generously shared his expertise. Where it's not, I've made a choice to serve the needs of the story. I urge readers to do their own research about this splendid animal. Without the following people, Pax would still be a roomful of crumpled pages, my kids, who, although grown, continue to remind me of the extraordinary bonds possible between children and animals. My writing groups, North and South, smart, insightful writers who don't tolerate lazy sentences. My agent, Stephen Molk, who understood and loved this book from the day I shared its tiny seed. My editor, Donna Bray, for her brilliant guidance. Olive HarperCollins for the incredible support. Patient David, for all the times I was with the foxes. And finally, Chris Crotcher, thank you for the story behind the story within the story. You know the one. About the author and illustrator. Sarah Pennypacker is the author of the award-winning, New York Times best-selling Clementine series, the acclaimed novel Summer of the Gypsy Moths, and the picture books Meet the Dullards, Pierre in Love, and Sparrow Girl. She divides her time between Cape Cod, Massachusetts, and Florida. You can visit her online at, external link to http://www.sarahpennypacker.com. John Clausen grew up in Niagara Falls, Canada, and now lives in Los Angeles, California. He is the New York Times best-selling author and illustrator of several books, including I Want My Hat Back and This Is Not My Hat, for which he won the Caldecott Medal. 2 of his picture books have been named Caldecott Honor Books, Sam and Dave Dig a Hole and Extra Yarn, winner of the Boston Globe Horn Book Award, both by Mac Barnett. You can visit him online at external link to http://www.burstoffbeaten.com. Discover great authors, exclusive offers, and more at external link to http://www.harpercollins.com/childrens.hc.com. Page Roman 3, Books by Sarah Penny Packer, Middle Grade Books, Summer of the Gypsy Moths, The Clementine Series, The Amazing World of Stuart, Stuartscape, and Stuart Goes to School, Dumbstruck, Picture Books, Meet the Dullards, Sparrow Girl, Pierre in Love,